France is in the middle of a political crisis. Why? Money. It's got a massive hole in its finances, and lawmakers can't agree on how to fix it. One measure that's popular with voters is a tax on the super rich. The idea is simple. Anyone with over 100 million euros worth of assets could face a 2% charge on their fortune. It's the brainchild of French economist Gabriel Zucman, and most French people are in favour of it. Historically, though, wealth taxes have not been a winner.
The French Empire was one of the most powerful in human history. At its height, it controlled almost 10% of the world's land area. From Southeast Asia to West Africa, the country we today associate with baguettes and cinema was a dominant global power. And that was particularly true in Africa. France oversaw territory spanning 17 modern-day nations, from Morocco to the Congo. Under the banner of a civilizing mission, France oversaw brutal occupations that engorged the wealth of the empire.
I'm really honored and happy to be here today because I think it is no secret that the current relationship between Africa and France is complicated. And in order for us to build a relationship that addresses issues that affect not only Africa, not only France, but the globe, then it's important for us to interrogate this very complicated relationship and ask ourselves three things. One, what is not efficient? Two, what is not ethical? Three, where do we see integrity gaps? And to be able to do these three things, we're going to have to be brutally honest. The history of colonization is understandably very important. For Africa, it's a path that is as painful as it is destructive. And the effects of colonization can still be felt to date. And I'm not just saying economically, but even on an interpersonal level. We, as Africans, feel the pain of colonization every single day. Now, the lack of a clear and strong acknowledgement of the continent's pain on this destructive past results in skepticism. And the absence of actions that will further push the acknowledgement is also a major issue in the current France and Africa relationship. In fact, the air of denial that France chooses to sit in is uncomfortable, not only for Africa, but also for France. And it does no good for either one of us.
The warning signs had been visible for years, yet almost no one in Europe had taken them seriously. Quiet policy shifts, new alliances, untold resource agreements, cross-border economic corridors, continental industrialization. Pax Africa had been moving, strategically and deliberately, but because its transformation lacked the explosions and spectacle that Europe was accustomed to seeing in global crises, Paris shrugged it off as background noise. It assumed nothing on the continent could ever threaten its place in the world. Then the strategy unfolded, and Europe realized too late that the tremors were not background noise. They were the opening waves of a geopolitical earthquake. Africa had changed. It had studied every failure of the past, every manipulation disguised as diplomacy, every contract signed under external pressure, every resource that left the continent without creating wealth at home. And quietly, steadily, it built a new model, one that placed sovereignty above dependency, value creation above raw extraction, and continental unity above foreign interests. France was the first to feel the impact. Europe was next. The shift began with energy. Several African energy-rich nations had already been reconsidering their export models, frustrated by decades of undervaluation and rigid Western pricing structures. But what changed the game was a collective decision. Africa would no longer export crude without controlling downstream refining capacity. It would no longer sell strategic minerals without guaranteed industrial processing rights, and it would no longer sign infrastructure deals that yielded more debt than development. These were simple principles, but revolutionary in their consequences. For France, whose industries depended heavily on African oil, gas, uranium, cobalt, and rare minerals, the new rules were an unexpected trap. Suddenly, long-standing contracts were revised. Prices shifted, new bidding requirements emerged, local participation clauses became mandatory, and the days of Africa serving as a cheap resource pit were over. French companies, accustomed to preferential access, were blindsided. Paris underestimated the extent to which African governments had been coordinating through regional blocs, pan-continental forums, and emerging South-South alliances. When the new strategy fully materialized, France found itself cornered not by hostility, but by Africa's new economic strength. It began in the Sahel, where nations rich in uranium, solar potential, and land corridor access announced sweeping reviews of all foreign mining and energy contracts. The announcement triggered quiet panic. In Paris, because France's nuclear-dependent energy grid relied heavily on uranium sourced from the region, for decades, officials in Paris had believed that these minerals would always flow uninterrupted, regardless of political changes. But Africa's revised strategy introduced new governance requirements and demanded that downstream nuclear fuel processing take place partly on African soil. Suddenly, France's energy security was no longer guaranteed. Within weeks, markets trembled. French regulators scrambled to reassure investors, but the numbers told a different story. Soaring costs, delayed shipments, looming shortages, and the risk of disrupted electricity across Europe. Meanwhile, Africa had already moved to protect its interests. Several nations with vast solar capacity announced the creation of a pan-African renewable energy grid, backed by investors from Asia and the Middle East. It aimed to produce surplus green energy that could be exported globally, bypassing traditional European intermediaries. The implications were enormous. Africa was no longer content with exporting raw materials. It would export refined energy, processed products, and technology. The continent was preparing for an industrial renaissance. France was unprepared. The second wave of Africa's strategy hit the agricultural sector. For years, European farming lobbies had benefited from massive subsidies that allowed their products to undercut African goods in African markets. But with a new collective policy, African governments implemented continent-wide tariff restructuring that protected local producers while restricting subsidized imports that destabilized African agriculture. The reaction in Europe was swift and angry. Analysts argued that Africa owed Europe open access due to historical cooperation. African commentators responded with a sharper interpretation. Europe's old model was built on structural advantage, and Africa's new strategy simply leveled the playing field. As Europe protested, something far more significant occurred. Africa launched continental supply chains that linked major agricultural belts, storage corridors, cold chain networks, and transport hubs across regions. What had once been fragmented markets were now unified economic zones capable of producing, processing, and exporting at scale. France suddenly found its agricultural exports declining sharply. Products that once sold easily in African supermarkets now faced tariffs, local competition, and continental branding campaigns promoting African-grown alternatives. By the time Paris realized what was happening, the trend was irreversible. The third wave of Africa's strategy struck the financial sector. Several major African central banks and finance ministries unveiled plans for a continental digital payment system designed to eliminate currency manipulation, reduce dependence on foreign banking institutions, and strengthen intra-African trade. The new system enabled transactions in local currencies and provided an alternative to the Western-dominated financial frameworks that had long dictated Africa's economic relations. France panicked. Its influence over certain African currencies eroded rapidly. Previous mechanisms that gave French banks leverage over monetary flows were replaced with African-controlled systems backed by new international partners. Entire economic tools France had used for decades evaporated. As financial autonomy increased, African nations began receiving record-breaking investment flows from Asia, the Gulf, Latin America, and emerging global players. Projects once financed by Europe now had alternative funding sources offering better terms. Europe quickly realized it was losing Africa not just politically or culturally, but financially. The fourth wave of Africa's strategy unfolded in diplomacy. African nations began voting more cohesively in global forums, challenging Western-dominated structures and pressing for reforms in international organizations. France, previously able to shape outcomes through long-standing influence networks, suddenly faced a bloc of African nations coordinating their diplomatic moves with strategic precision. Global institutions, once predictable, became theaters of shifting power. Europe felt the pressure. France felt the corner tightening. The fifth wave was the most disruptive, the mineral policy overhaul. Africa announced that rare earths, cobalt, lithium, gold, bauxite, manganese, and other strategic resources would no longer be exported without guaranteed local refining and manufacturing. Global companies were given a choice: set up industrial facilities in Africa or lose access to the minerals that powered modern technology. This was the moment that triggered full-blown panic in Europe. Tech manufacturers raised alarm as mineral supplies shrank. Automotive leaders warned that electric vehicle production could stall. Renewable energy companies reported delays in acquiring essential components. French industries, deeply intertwined with African mining, found themselves in crisis. European leaders held emergency meetings. France declared the situation a threat to its national economic stability, but Africa stood firm. The message was clear: the era of cheap extraction was over. What intensified Europe's alarm was not Africa's assertiveness, it was Africa's unity. Regional blocs aligned their mining policies. Resource-rich nations coordinated terms. Investment frameworks were harmonized. Africa had never been so synchronized, and this coordination gave it immense geopolitical weight. Yet Africa's new strategy was not anti-European, it was pro-African. The objective was not to punish Europe, but to ensure that Africa finally benefited from its own wealth. Europe misinterpreted this shift because it had grown accustomed to asymmetrical relationships that favored its interests. France in particular struggled to adapt, the old playbook no longer worked. Offers to renegotiate were met with demands for industrial equity. Appeals for long-standing friendship were countered with reminders of decades of imbalance. Attempts to use diplomatic pressure collapsed against Africa's newfound alliances. The turning point came when several African nations signed a landmark industrial pact with emerging global powers, forming a resource-to-manufacturing corridor that bypassed Europe entirely. Factories, processing centers, and technology hubs began rising across the continent. What Europe once considered pipe dreams were becoming realities. France's influence, once deeply rooted, was uprooted in a matter of years. European institutions sounded the alarm. If Africa continued this path, Europe would face commodity shortages, industrial slowdowns, and energy vulnerabilities. Businesses accelerated their relocation plans. Investors poured into Africa's booming sectors. Paris could only watch as its economic footprint shrank. Europe had never expected Africa to rise so quickly. It had underestimated the continent's strategic patience, geopolitical learning curve, and collective ambition. Now, with Africa executing a coordinated strategy, Europe found itself reacting rather than leading. As the crisis deepened, European leaders warned that Africa's new path would destabilize traditional global supply chains. Africa responded by saying those supply chains were never designed for Africa's benefit. And for the first time in modern economic history, Africa set the terms. France was cornered, Europe was in panic, and the world was witnessing the beginning of a new global balance. The panic spreading across Europe was not simply economic, it was psychological. For decades, European policymakers had operated under the assumption that Africa's geopolitical future would always flow through Paris, Brussels, or London. That assumption had shaped their foreign policy, their trade infrastructure, their energy strategies, and their military presence. But Africa's new strategy inverted the hierarchy. It placed the continent at the center of its own narrative, leaving Europe orbiting around a world it no longer fully controlled. In France, think tanks scrambled to explain the transformation. Some blamed global competitors for empowering Africa, while others blamed former administrations for failing to build genuine partnerships. But a growing number of analysts finally acknowledged the truth. Africa was doing nothing unusual. It was simply doing what every major power had already done, protecting its interests, leveraging its resources, and building the conditions for its own prosperity. The shift felt dramatic not because Africa was aggressive, but because Europe was unprepared to live without the privileges it had always assumed were permanent. Pressure mounted in every corner of France's economy. Energy companies reported disrupted supply chains as African nations renegotiated uranium, gas, and crude contracts. Industrial plants faced shortages of rare minerals needed to sustain manufacturing output. Agriculture exporters struggled against Africa's new tariff barriers. Even the banking sector, long accustomed to routing African financial flows through European institutions, found itself increasingly irrelevant as Africa adopted digital settlement systems backed by global alternatives. For France, it felt like the ground beneath its geopolitical foundation was dissolving. Meanwhile, Africa thrived. New ports expanded, energy corridors grew, manufacturing zones multiplied. A continental digital market strengthened. Africa was experiencing the beginning of an era it had long been denied a chance to write the rules of its own engagement with the world. The strongest shock to France came when several African nations unveiled a joint commodities exchange designed to eliminate the practice of foreign price setting. Minerals, agricultural goods, and energy products would now be priced through African benchmarks instead of European trading floors. Economists in Paris immediately declared it dangerous and destabilizing, but African analysts called it overdue. The new exchange struck at the heart of Europe's historical advantage. By controlling the pricing structure of African goods, Europe had kept the continent dependent, but Africa's strategy dismantled that mechanism overnight. France publicly pleaded for dialogue, insisting that the new system risked triggering global inflation. Africa responded by saying that the old system had triggered decades of African poverty. Global inflation, in Africa's view, was simply the world paying the real price for its resources. As panic spread through European industries, African leaders met at a high-level summit. In a historic statement, they declared that Africa's wealth would no longer leave the continent without creating value at home. They vowed to build factories, energy refineries, mineral processing centers, and automotive plants. They pledged to diversify their partnerships and never again rely on a single foreign bloc for economic growth. The message was unmistakable. Africa was no longer negotiating from weakness. For France, the declaration was an economic earthquake. Its companies had built entire business models around cheap African inputs. Now, those models no longer worked. Investors began abandoning French industries tied to Africa. Some moved their capital to Asia, others to North America, but a surprising amount flowed directly into Africa where growth projections had skyrocketed. In Brussels, European leaders held emergency sessions. They warned of strategic vulnerabilities, urging member states to re-establish influence on the continent. But Africa, for the first time, had options. It could partner with Asia, the Gulf, Latin America, or internal regional markets, and it was using all of them. Europe had overestimated its importance and underestimated Africa's readiness. As weeks passed, France's diplomatic posture shifted from assertive to defensive. Officials attempted to revive old narratives about partnership, but Africa countered with data. The imbalance was undeniable. Africa exported raw materials and imported poverty. Europe imported resources and exported finished goods. The new strategy simply reversed the logic and created parity. In public, French officials spoke of cooperation. In private, they feared losing strategic access forever. The crisis deepened when African nations announced a collective review of all military agreements with Europe. Bases that had operated for decades suddenly faced expiration. Overflight rights were reconsidered. Training missions were placed under scrutiny. Africa no longer accepted military arrangements that offered little in return for security sovereignty. For France, which maintained one of the largest military footprints in Africa, this was a geopolitical nightmare. Without those bases, France's global reach would shrink dramatically. Without logistical hubs, its influence would fade. Without access to resource corridors, its industries would suffer. In a span of months, France saw its geopolitical map redrawn. Europe had believed Africa would always need it, but Africa had learned to diversify its alliances, strengthen its institutions, and coordinate its strategy. The continent's rising middle class, booming urban centers, and resource-driven industrialization had created a new kind of partner, one capable of negotiating from strength rather than desperation. The turning point, the moment that solidified France's cornered position, came when several African nations signed long-term industrial pacts with economic giants outside Europe. These agreements included building EV battery plants, refining centers, high-speed rail corridors, agricultural processing hubs, and digital infrastructure. Not a single project passed through Paris. It was the clearest indication yet that France's influence had been replaced. The panic in Europe reached its peak. Commentators predicted higher energy costs, slower industrial growth, and competitive disadvantages against other global powers. Some compared the crisis to an economic decoupling, while others warned it was a geopolitical tipping point. But Africa framed it differently. To African leaders, it was not about pushing Europe into panic. It was about pushing Africa into prosperity. A new reality emerged. If Europe wanted access to Africa's resources, markets, and opportunities, it would have to negotiate on Africa's terms. And if France wanted to rebuild its presence, it would have to abandon assumptions of automatic loyalty. The continent was rising, and the world had no choice but to adjust. The final blow to France's old model came not from contracts or diplomacy, but from public sentiment. Across Africa, young people representing the fastest growing population on Earth embraced the new strategy with overwhelming enthusiasm. They viewed it as the long-awaited correction to centuries of extraction and interference. They demanded that their nations invest in industries, not dependency. Value chains, not raw exports. Sovereignty, not subservience. This demographic momentum gave Africa an advantage Europe could not match. France suddenly found itself trying to win goodwill it once took for granted. Africa had moved on. The continent stepped confidently into a future built on self-determination, regional integration, and global leverage. It forged partnerships from a position of strength. It negotiated with clarity. It defended its resources and its people. It defined its own destiny. France, once the dominant force in African affairs, now watched from the outside, cornered by a strategy it never imagined Africa would build. Europe, accustomed to setting terms, now scrambled to adapt to a world in which Africa was no longer a passive participant but an active architect of global change. In the end, the message echoed across continents: Africa's rise was not a threat, it was a correction. A long overdue one, and those who believed Africa would always remain in the margins had underestimated the power of a continent finally claiming its place at the center of the global future.